As you'll probably have noticed, both in terms of dance music and even in terms of soundtracks, the 80s have never been more popular than they are right now. Stranger Things soundtrack's a really good example that what we've effectively got is a new appreciation of some of the technology that existed 30 years or so ago, and in terms of the sort of weight of drum machines and synths from that era and what they can bring to dance music and soundtracks right now. And what we're going to do in this video is to look at bit crushing, which is a process which allows us to emulate the behavior of some of the earliest digital recording systems. So when samplers first arrived on the scene in earnest in the 80s, they didn't have the high sort of sample resolution and bit depth that we associate now with digital recording. Whereas now through our audio interfaces, we can capture unbelievably high quality audio. Things were more restricted then, and the chips that we use for capturing sound didn't have quite the resolution that we're used to these days. And with that comes a certain sonic characteristic, and bit crushing allows us to go after that even in modern mixes. What I've done is to write this sort of quite retro sounding sort of 80s track, and I've used Linn drums for the drums, which again is a drum machine from the 80s. And what I want to do is to add a slightly more crunchy 80s style quality to those beats. But before we do that, let's just hear how they sound right now. Okay, so we're going to just focus on the drums, and you can see that I've grouped these so that when I press the solo button here, we're going to hear the kick and the snare and the hats. Now, what I want to do is just to think about processing these sounds so that they have a slightly more 80s feel. In other words, maybe they've been sort of sampled through lower resolution audio processing, if you like. So let's just hear them by themselves, and then we'll add a bit crusher and begin to see what that can do. Okay, so that's how the beats sound right now. Now for bit crushing, what I'm going to do is to use Native Instruments Byte plugin. And what that does is to simply give me, well, first and foremost, the opportunity to reduce both sample rate and resolution. Now, there are a number of ways that you can think about sample rate and resolution, and it helps to kind of have a picture in mind. Let's imagine for a second that instead of listening to audio, what we were doing instead was sort of taking a video, a film of something that was happening in front of us. Well, what we need is imagine an old school video camera. We basically need something which is going to record the movement of the image as it goes by. And that effectively is sort of the sort of sample rate. It's an equivalent of a sample rate. It's literally like a shutter opening and closing and taking a picture in order that we can determine or see that video as video. In other words, one frame after another to give us playback that feels like it's continuous. But every time the shutter opens, it also needs to take a picture. It needs to actually capture that image fully. It's no good if we've got sort of an unrepresentative picture every single time the shutter opens. So the quality of the picture that's being taken, well, we call that resolution. So effectively over here on the left-hand side, we're controlling shutter speed, if you like. In other words, that's the sample rate. And over here, we're controlling the quality of the picture, which we refer to as resolution. And sample rate is measured in kilohertz, and resolution is measured in bits. So it stands to reason that if I reduce both of those, what we're going to do is to start to blunt off the edges. We're going to lose the kind of hi-fi quality that we've got in these samples right now, and we're going to start deliberately downgrading them. Now, at the moment, the mix is set to 100%, so any moves that we make are going to be dramatic. We're going to hear these things happening fully. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take sample rate down to about half of where it was. So in other words, down to about 22 kilohertz, and I'm going to take the bit rate down to 8-bit sampling, a bit like the sort of SID chip from the Commodore 64. And what we should immediately hear is that there's a kind of degradation in the quality of the signal. I'll punch it in halfway through. Okay, so we can immediately hear the effect of reducing the sort of sample rate and the resolution and of bit crushing overall. We get this kind of aliasy, overtony, crunchy sound. It's almost like the sample process can't quite keep up with what we're trying to do, and that's exactly what we want. And if I want less of that, then of course what I can do is to start modifying either of these different things. I could either make the effect more extreme by potentially reducing the bit rate, or increasing it in order to get a slightly better quality picture. So let's hear that first. So at 4-bit, we get this really sort of crunchy sound because literally the sample rate can't keep up with the process that we're trying to do. And as a result, we get this really sort of squared off sound. Now, what we've also got are additional controls which allow us to think about things in a slightly more contoured way. So the jitter control actually makes the sample rate variable. What it does is to constantly sort of be resampling, giving us slightly more control rather than a sort of static level. It's giving us a slightly more variable quality to sample rate there. And similarly, what I've got is a kind of similar control over here called crunch for the sample resolution. Let's just experiment with those two dials and we'll see how the noise element of this sound changes as a result of increasing jitter and crunch. Okay, so let's keep crunch low, and what we'll do is reduce sample rate a little bit more and see how the jitter effect works with a slightly more extreme example. Okay, and you can particularly hear how it's sort of interacting with the kick drum as we boost jitter considerably. Okay, so we'll set these dials, we'll give a fair amount of jitter, and we'll dial in a little bit of crunch here as well. What I've also got is a chance to filter this sound both before the filtering process and after it. So I've got a chance to determine what the sort of EQ shape of the sound going into byte, and also process it sort of after the fact as well. So if I want to filter the processed result, I'd use this dial. And if I want to control the EQ of the sound going into the processor, I'd use this dial. Okay, and you're going to hear a more dramatic effect from the second dial because effectively it's filtering the second sort of stage of the processing at the end rather than the sound going in. We've also got a sort of completely separate saturation algorithm here as well, which is going to allow us to boost a considerable amount of extra volume into a saturation circuit. So we can give things more of a push there. And then down in the bottom right-hand corner, we've got ways of being able to control the artifacts or the noise that are generated as a result of working with byte. So here we've got a chance to decide really how roughed up we want this sound to become. And we've got a couple of choices here. We could either create something pretty extreme and then maybe back down the mix dial so that we're bleeding some of this sort of process signal in alongside the original, or we can just decide to create a sort of static set of controls which feel like they're appropriate for this. And I want to do that, I think. I want the whole of this sound to feel like it's sort of stuck in the past a little bit. So I'm going to keep the mix dial at 100%. But what I'm going to do is just put the bit crusher in with the other sounds within the mix and just sort of see if I can find some settings that feel a little bit more like they belong alongside the synth and bass line. Okay, I like this kind of extra white noise that I'm getting from this sound. So we've stuck with 12-bit sampling, that's working nicely, and we've reduced sample rate as well. And through a combination of these other sort of controls and parameters, we've got an opportunity to kind of really tailor this sound, either with additional saturation drive or to sort of focus on the white noise elements and work out kind of the sort of stereo width that we want from those using expander and the filter controls as well to determine the shape of the signal going into byte and also the process signal at the end as well.